Have you considered the potential that humans are just too at the mercy of our emotions or programming to be able to reach our civilizational potential? I was thinking about this when the most recent potential release about aliens was coming about, and I had a conversation with a friend saying, I don't think that aliens could be even 10% more emotional than us by whatever criteria you want to cause that, more emotionally reactive, because coordination would become so difficult if you were to turn it up to maybe 10 or 20% more, that you'd be able to achieve shit. Like, have you considered that we might just be kind of bouncing off a glass ceiling, that the creatures that we are so self-limiting that no matter how much we try to transcend our own programming, that we are sort of destined to fail?
Yeah, so this is there's a common question that I've received many times of like, do I actually get human nature? And
I wasn't asking whether you get human nature or not.
Well, they're related questions.
Okay.
Right? It's a related question.
Okay.
And it usually comes in the form of, I'm dubious of two things. I'm dubious that people can be, or I'll say it another way. I'm concerned that people are too irrational and too rivalrous to do anything like this emergent coordination shit you're talking about. That the level of rationality and the level of anti-rivalry, right? So like wisdom and compassion or whatever it is that would be needed don't seem to be well demonstrated across the population anywhere. So what kind of Aquarian nonsense is this? So let's address that. It's a real politic critique, right? Or concern. Am I asking the same thing you're asking?
Not far off, yes. I mean, I wasn't accusing you directly. It was more abstract, but yes, you're right.
Yeah. Have I ever considered?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you the first part of how I approach this. So in the same way, I'll actually use it as an example of when I was saying a good way to sense make is to do dialectic. So everything on the nature versus nurture arguments and the range of what people thought nurture could do were topics I really wanted to see what were all of the thinking and what was the basis for the thinking. And were there any kind of axioms that were unquestioned or new possibilities that could change the landscape from even those ideas? So one thing is when we look at, say, how violent versus altruistic or rational or whatever metric we want to look at and however we assess looking at it across a population to get some kind of distribution. First, I would say I'm extraordinarily dubious of pretty much all social science of this type for a bunch of reasons. One is it almost all started post-industrial revolution and much more recent than that. And almost all of human history that conditioned us genetically and otherwise was in tribal environments. And those are so different. And just like we're saying, even the nature of Facebook, engaging with it changes the patterns of what we think, feel, believe, react to. And there's tests that Facebook has run of like, we can make people more depressed and happier and believe different things just by putting changing what's in the algorithm a little bit, right? So post-ubiquitous capitalism and ubiquitous industrialization and ubiquitous nuclear family homes and a bunch of things, none of which were natural to the human evolutionary environment, but they're conditioning that kind of won. And so it became an ubiquitous conditioning. We do the social science then and then pretend that that's not conditioning and call it human nature because it's ubiquitous conditioning. That's silly, right? And then there's so few indigenous people left or whatever, we can just make them statistical outliers. Even though they have very, very different patterns on a lot of those things. Also, so that's one reason that I'm very dubious of the social sciences. And this is even like when they're trying to do a good job, not like the nonsense social science that was reifying why whites were superior in the early US based on bad interpretations of Darwin and phrenology and stuff, right? But you can see from that stuff how easily bias influences something as complex as social science, complex and consequential. The other thing is that there are a lot of things about people's behavioral dispositions that change with development, and development is not factored. We don't factor levels of higher stages of human development post just becoming 18, even though they're very real things. We just put it all together under a bell curve. But when you look at the work of Piaget and then the kind of neo-Piagetian educational philosophers that were looking at human development in childhood, and it's very clear there's neurologic development and corresponding change in fine motor skills and logic skills and verbal skills, et cetera. And we get to like 18, school's over, and then development ends, right? And then that's a fully developed person. That's gibberish, right? Like, that's not a fully developed person. So what is development beyond that? So you have a bunch of people who have worked on higher stages of development. Zach Stein's a good colleague of mine, worked on that very heavily and looked at the work of Kohlberg and Graves and lots of people who've worked on that. But it's like the complexity of someone's cognitive model, the development of their moral models, the development of their aesthetic, the development of their capacity to perspective take, perspective seek, and perspective synthesize. Those things keep developing. Right? Or they can keep developing. One can do things to develop them. And then at those higher developmental capacities, there are different behavioral dispositions. And this is not just typologically, they're typologically left or right or whatever. This is, so we could say if the society was supporting more development of that type, you would have a totally different bell curve, right? But that's not a topic that's usually factored. So there's a bunch of things like this where I would say the social science all needs taken with some grains of salt. One thing I have looked at is on the traits that matter most to a civilization that would work well, I've looked for positive deviance, outliers of the statistical norms on the positive side, to see is there an is the upper boundary that we think of really the upper boundary, or are there places where what we think of as the upper boundary is the median? Right? Like, it's quite different. And so there's heaps of examples, but if you look at like through much of the last few thousand years across lots of different cultures and different geographies, have Jewish families raised better educated kids than the people around them much of the time? Yeah, they have. And so are there cultural dispositions that can lead to higher qualities of education and correspondingly different qualities of ways of being, right? Different types of disposition. So then you have that for a long time, the Jews all as a diaspora pretty much didn't defect on each other, right? And the way the Jewish law is structured, it's kind of like a formal logical system. So they're also getting very good at how to be able to think in formal ways, which makes them which is why they became good at science and finance and other things that were thinking in formal logic was relevant. It's a really important example because you could say, well, if what Jewish culture gave in terms of the development of education and rationality and non-defection on each other could happen across the whole population, would that change things? Yeah, it really would. What about the Jainists? Do you have a religion where across a long period of time nobody hurts bugs or plants? Yeah, you do. What about the violent kids in the society? What about the sociopaths? Across a huge population, the violence bell curve is completely different, right? You have extraordinarily low violence across the whole population. How can that be? Well, they're developed differently. Can you have a population where almost everyone is violent? Yeah, there's a few cultures where violence is ubiquitous, right? And you can see in cultures where kids grow up as child soldiers that you don't make it to adulthood without killing people. And so it's like the Janjaweed and the Jains are both possible in human nature depending upon conditioning. So the idea that what we naturally are is the median of that is just gibberish. It's just not understanding how we create societal structures that create conditioning that support the societal structure. So what if we had something that was conditioning nonviolence and compassion more like Jains or Buddhists or Quakers, and conditioning rationality more like Nordic Bildung countries or Jews? And what if we had a few of those things and we brought them together into not just an educational, but a cultural developmental system? Could we have, is it within human nature, if rightly conditioned, to have higher potentials? Yeah, it totally is within human nature, if rightly conditioned, to have higher potentials. What if in addition we created an economic system where we addressed perverse incentive? So rather than the guy who externalizes the most harm to the environment makes the most money and then gets the most chicks and status and whatever, to actually all of the harms, the externalized harms, are internalized to the cost. So the guy who gets the most money is the one who does the most omni-benefit and no harm anywhere. Well, now there's no sociopathic niche to condition bad behavior and bad values in people. And doing the thing that's good for others ends up being good for you actually is conditioning the values even from self-centeredness, right? It starts to bridge them in that way. Well, how do we make an economic system that rigorously internalizes externalities and addresses perverse incentive? That's a really deep question for changing what we would call human nature. That isn't human nature. It's the nature of made up human coordination systems, right? Does all property law, does all access to resource have to be at the level of individual private property? No. Can we do things that change that fundamentally? Is every good fundamentally rivalrous because it's scarce? No, digital goods made it very clear that you have things that are not only not scarce, but anti-rivalrous. The more people that use them, the more valuable it becomes. But we still make them artificially scarce because of the artificially scarce dollars, because of the artificially scarce materials economy. Can we make a materials economy that isn't artificially scarce by making it closed loop with enough energy to run it? Yeah, we can. So the point is, do we see positive deviance of, you look at a very wealthy population, old wealth families, while they still have the integrity of how to do dynasty, or even just the kids going to the best prep schools in the US, right? And then who go to the best Ivy League schools and have all the best tutors. Do you have the same distribution of success in life of the kids coming out of Exeter and the kids coming out of an average public school? No, they're totally different. Well, what if everybody went to Exeter and had that corresponding life since they were little? Well, it would be totally different. Well, but we can't afford to do that. Yeah, so here's the thing. The idea of the dumb masses is class propaganda. Because the upper class that has access to the things that develop them having more capacity is why they end up having more capacity, is a major part of why they have more capacity. And then the idea that some people like them need to be in positions to rule because the masses are too dumb is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then we'll keep the masses dumb by not giving them better educational resources and other types of things that would create a difference there. So I actually think that the idea of the irrationality and the rivalrousness of the masses is one of the deepest parts of propaganda zeitgeist of ruling classes forever, because it justifies the basis for rulership.
Cultural conditioning masquerading as human nature in the modern world is something that I've never even thought of before. That is so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, you've ran these clubs and you see all these teenagers come into the clubs and how they behave. And so you've seen patterns that are on repeat so much, you're like, I know human nature. I've seen this 100,000 times, right? But if you went to the tribes in the Western Amazon and saw how the teenagers there were engaging, who'd already been doing ayahuasca for 10 years since the time they were little, it's not the same. There are some things, yes, they have a sex drive, right? Yes, there are certain aspects of paying attention to social hierarchies that everyone's going to notice. But there's more that's different, a lot more that's different, right? That's conditioning.